Her book, Ecoliberation, Reimagining Resistance in the Green Scare was published by McGill University Queen's Press in 2021. The book is the result of over a decade of on-the-ground ethnographic research with animal and earth liberation activists. Ecoliberation sits firmly within the intersectional and social justice traditions that resonate so strongly with Antioch College's mission and history. Dr. Grubbs was recently awarded the Southern Ohio Council on Higher Education's Excellence in Research Award for her scholarship, which spans fields and topics like environmental and animal advocacy, feminist anthropology, environmental communication, and queer studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Grubbs.
Thank you all for coming. I know it's hot and it's late, and I very much appreciate you all being present and supporting the book and just kind of learning a little bit more about the project. And so I have some notes, and I'm going to juggle between notes and then reading a little bit from the book itself. So I published Ecoliberation, Reimagining Resistance and the Green Scare with McGill Queens for specific reasons. I chose to publish with a series called Outspoken, which is dedicated to marginalized academics that maintain a commitment to social justice. They have an unwavering and unapologetic dedication to these scholars. They live in the fringe margins where activists and academics meet. The ethnographic study that became the basis for the book was when I was living in Washington, D.C. I spent the previous decade doing what is oftentimes called good activism. I signed petitions, I boycotted corporations, I voted for political candidates and ballot measures that I thought would shift the needle. But I was growing frustrated with the idea that systemic change came about by asking permission. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the Pacific Northwest was the so-called epicenter of this strategy of activism called ecological direct action. This strategy, sometimes called monkey wrenching, focuses on directly intercepting and interrupting mechanisms of violence. So these tactics include tree spiking, blockades, arson, lab raids, encampments, to name just a few. Concurrently, anti-capitalists were organizing and focusing on the international trade and globalization, specifically looking at the World Trade Organization. In a market dominated by multinational conglomerates who benefit from the revolving door of lobby front groups and politicians and executives, the task of naming, blaming, and shaming companies becomes particularly challenging. Scholars refer to this economic and social moment as neoliberal capitalism. Where did I just read that? Which gives the type of sovereignty to corporations. Iowa Ong coins this term of corporate sovereignty. She calls it the exceptional status of capitalist entities that's awarded through the deregulation of industry and the hyper-regulation of public scrutiny. In addition to the millions of dollars of damage inflicted, the beautiful work of Earth First, Earth Liberation Front, and the Animal Liberation Front produced an extensive visual archive of the mechanistic destruction of ecological systems, including violence against other than human animals. So documentaries like Pickaxe and Butterfly captured some of the work that became known as the Animal and Earth Liberation Movement. The movement moved away from a rights framework, which always already implies a hierarchy. Someone grants the right to have rights. Instead, it advanced a liberatory framework that built on anarchist principles of mutual aid and respect and collaboration. Ecosystems and species exist for their own purpose within this framework, and our work to protect and preserve them is not so that humans can use them for longer, read preservation and conservation, nor is it about how we can exploit them a little less violently, read welfare, but rather it is because humans do not have the right of ownership over these ecological systems and species. So this is clearly a threatening ideological approach to capitalists and to speciesists, a long word, which just simply believing that there is a species that has a hierarchical right over all other species. So on the curtails of 9/11, the lobby front group many have heard of, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, sponsored a legislation to target crimes committed in the name of animal and earth liberation. This legislation, called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, or the AETA, was the only one of its kind in 2006 when it passed. It did what hate crime legislation does by focusing not solely on the action, but rather it focuses on the motivation behind the action. If you burned down a laboratory because you were angry with how they treated their employees, you would be charged with crimes specific to trespassing, arson, and so on. But if you burned down a lab because they conducted experiments on animals, under the AETA, you would face federal terrorism enhancements. This moves the prosecution from the state level to the federal, and it carries longer prison sentences, housing those incarcerated in special prisons for so-called terrorists, and restricts the ways in which defendants can present their case. The same year this was passed, a massive interagency investigation culminated in the roundup of activists in what was called Operation Backfire. The FBI worked with 7 different federal and state agencies to surveil over 20 clandestine activists for roughly 2 years, engaging in COINTELPRO-style domestic surveillance, including the deployment of undercover cops and cooperative witnesses. The government successfully disrupted these underground cells that had been challenging neoliberal capitalism. By 2011, when I attended my first home demonstration, the chilling effects of the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and several high-profile arrests reverberated through activist circles. A prominent journalist, Will Potter, coined the phrase, "Green is the new red," highlighting the significance of the so-called Green Scare by historically linking it to the Red Scare. Access and trust in closed activist spaces was earned over time, and even then, there seemed to be a delicate dance for above-ground activists like myself. I came to the project because I was tired of watching the planet burn around me. I wanted to be a part of something that encompassed more than just animal and earth liberation. As an anarchist, I wanted what David Pello calls total liberation. I wanted to be in spaces where folks demanded radical change, where systems of domination were spoken of in conversation with one another, and where the structure was horizontal, leaderless, and anti-authoritarian. So I threw myself into an ethnographic study that would take me all over the continent. I spent roughly 6 years working with activists in various collectives, attending convergences, and interviewing folks. During that time, I presented and published my work in various spaces. I faced institutional pressure to disclose my research. I was thrown into public debates with activists. I've omitted pages and pages of work because it didn't feel ethical to print. I negotiated physical and personal boundaries from that very first demonstration when someone called me out for not being electively sterilized. My partner was arrested for direct action, and we spent 18 months under federal investigation. I create space for anthropological vulnerabilities because that is one way we can leverage our privileges as a scholar while also calling out the ways in which we are not. I tell stories to illustrate theory. The stories themselves become the theory. In the introduction, I describe this process, and I'll read a passage from that. The stories included here are merely parts to a larger whole, and in many ways, parts to a larger whole that is fragmented between the documented and the forgotten. There are stories told in this book, stories I've told in other publications, stories I have saved to tell another day, and stories that will never make their way onto paper because I'm protecting the activists who shared them. Because of the influx nature of non-hierarchical direct action campaigns, this book captures a particular time and space within the animal and earth liberation movement. The collectives and campaigns are fluid, in that the activists travel between them. Their titles change, and they disband and reorganize in the face of victories and defeats. The activists I work with face ongoing repression that impacts their ability to speak freely about their involvement. I am intentionally vague in places to protect those individuals whom I respect and whom I've made a commitment to protect in this work. The degree to which their fluidity is public and transparent varies, and thus it is not always annotated in the text here. As I move through the animal and earth liberation movement, I'm keenly aware that the roadmap I use today may not be the roadmap for tomorrow. It is in this vein that my ethnography is distinct, leaving no breadcrumbs behind for others to follow. The vignettes provide a window into the complicated rhetorical acts that do more than just call out violence. For example, I tell the story about a demonstration outside of someone's house to show that by performing neoliberal capitalism, by naming a random person who works for AstraZeneca, by shaming them for not making the company change their practices, and blaming them for being part of the problem, the audience, those on the street, those in the apartment building, and even the ones being targeted, are brought in to what Jose Esteban Munoz referred to as disidentification. They disidentify with neoliberal capitalism itself. The ridiculousness that an individual attacked can have any power in this system points out that the individual is powerless within this economic system. Thus, political theater queers our understanding of dominant ideology. It creates a spectacle of it. I have another passage to share from. The performance of a public vigil, for example, re-articulates the social and political discourses that do not allow humans to publicly mourn the loss of animal life in laboratories by exposing, altering, and/or inverting taken for granted understandings and practices of vivisection. The vigil, which can entail activists gathering in a public space, lighting candles, wearing all black, calls into question the precarity of animal lives through a graphic depiction of animal suffering. It makes visible the invisibility of how speciesism is an accepted part of interpolation of the good citizen. The vigil further challenges the cognitive dissonance humans use to separate products from persons. The use of public performance as direct action calls into question and challenges a slew of accepted truisms: that human animals are more valuable than non-human animals, that doing one's job safeguards one from political and/or ethical responsibility, that government and corporate interests are distinct and separate, that legislation is passed for the public good rather than private profit, and particularly relevant here, that average, everyday people are powerless to change various structures, laws, and customs. Direct action is a queer performance that plays with and transgresses the normative boundaries of society, and it poses an effective, convincing, and powerful critique that queers social and political normativity. From ACT UP to Circus Amok, queer activism challenged systems of power with exaggerated mimicry on the public stage of the streets. Circus Amok organized home demonstrations that targeted defense contractors in an effort to challenge the disproportionate government budgets for defense rather than public health. In an effort to queer the anti-war efforts, campaigns such as Absurd Response to an Absurd War emerged and relied on a strategic rhetoric of exaggeration. Activists utilized public die-ins and drag races to draw attention to health disparities and violence that disproportionately inflicted the gay community in New York City. Play, as a political strategy, refers to the playful jest infused with satirical performance that brings lightness to otherwise fiery activism. Drag races, whether they reenact Judy Garland's funeral or mark the anniversary of the police violence at Stonewall Inn, managed to mix glitter, fishnet, stockings, and holistic political analyses of queer repression. While activists mourned those who they love, they fought to protect those still living. They used play not only as a strategy to challenge the violent social structures, but also to laugh and temporarily suspend their pain. Similarly, the animal and earth liberation movement engages in play by delivering elaborate neoliberal proclamations, splashing red paint on fur coats, issuing clever communiques, seizing poaching vessels at sea, and even interrupting a confrontational demonstration with a 5-minute dance party. These acts and many more embody a critique to neoliberalism, to capitalism and speciesism. And importantly, they allow activists to form supportive, dynamic communities to mourn, grieve, rage, and celebrate with. The use of playfulness is quite telling in the face of this topic and target, animal abuse and exploitation. Activists utilize the empowering nature of play as an attempt to counter the overwhelming sense of loss of animal lives. Continually witnessing the suffocating reality of animal cruelty and repeatedly protesting outside of a lobster restaurant or a university lab is emotionally exhausting. Working with clandestine networks of people, placing trust in others despite the intense vulnerabilities of committing illegal direct action together, produces a particular type of paranoia. Constantly reminding oneself of the millions of animals that are killed dominates the work of an animal liberationist. The power structure is so blatantly controlled by animal oppressors that even the most strident campaign can appear minuscule compared to multi-billion-dollar animal and ecology use industries. The book is a negotiation of the tension between being disciplined by the state and, in contrast, how the state is disciplined by activists. My interviews and field notes point to additional tensions within these activist spaces, where issues of human reproduction, caregiving, and sexuality, and sexual assault, and racism, and exclusion, and co-optation produce divisions that permeate. It was important to me to document the mechanisms of state-sanctioned violence and the violence that happens within these movement spaces. The distrust between activists is exacerbated by state violence, and it has perpetuated the silence surrounding sexual assault. A COINTELPRO neutralization technique called badjacketing was the intentional use of rumors and false evidence to create suspicion around a certain activist. Another use of this is snitch jacketing, which explicitly tries to paint someone as an informant. Women within progressive movements have long carried the guilt of speaking out against male organizers. But suspicion culture does not operate on the concern that speaking out would bring down the righteous hero. Suspicion culture, an inherently disciplinary power, is the fear that you yourself will be called an agent of the state. Activists that have called out prominent organizers have faced smear campaigns that are specifically focused on the integrity of the survivor. The book focuses on these tensions: repression, liberation, transgression, interpolation. I share one final story from the book as a point of unsettled closure. My work focuses on the intricate ways in which people construct and deconstruct meaning in shared spaces. Yes, everything is a performance. Authenticity does not exist. But what do these performances, these acts of resistance and repression, tell us about ourselves and our shared world? How can we lean into our vulnerabilities as a methodology that unearths what David Graeber calls the political imaginary? And so I share one final vignette that leaves kind of an unsettledness. I wandered into the tabling room and made my way around the small space by stopping at each table. In one of the most uncomfortable moments of my research, I reached the table of a prominent eco-activist. I had met them before and heard them discuss the practice of elective sterilization as a way to combat ecological destruction. I was aware of this divisive politic when I approached them, wearing my infant in a wrap. As I discussed earlier, I do not often wear jewelry and intentionally do not do so during political actions. However, that day I had worn an heirloom ring on my fourth finger on my left hand, commonly known as the ring finger. I had forgotten to remove it prior to entering the space. I caught them looking at the child wrapped around my abdomen, and then their eyes immediately traveled to my hand. Their nose scrunched and clearly conveyed their disapproval. They turned away, closing off the opportunity to speak with them. As they walked away, I slowly removed the ring from my finger and put it in my pocket. Again, I was left feeling ostracized in a space in which I so deeply wanted to belong. Although there was no verbal exchange, I found myself narrating an explanation in my head as I stood there. My mother had been given the ring by her grandmother, my great-grandmother. The ring was a symbol of gratitude from my great-grandfather to my great-grandmother. As Jews living in Nazi-occupied Poland, they were displaced from their homes in the 1930s. My great-grandfather had been taken as a prisoner of war and held in a detention camp. My great-grandmother, worried about his survival, sold the few pieces of jewelry she had smuggled with her during their expulsion. She used the money to purchase bread rations and would illegally sneak food into the camp. Years later, my great-grandfather was able to save enough money to purchase her some small second-hand jewelry to give as gifts. The diamonds most certainly are unethical, and the symbolism of love as a commodity is no less problematic here. But for me, the ring symbolizes resistance and resilience. In that space, at that conference, none of that mattered. I felt shame and was annoyed with myself for even bringing it. I suppose this contradictory moment captures the ways in which I wrestle with deeply personal inconsistencies, but it also captures how tenuous our sense of belonging can be within any given space. The ethnography weaves throughout these vignettes, these stories, as a way to illustrate how ethnographic work is deeply personal to the work that we do, but also how leftist spaces can perpetuate and replicate some of these dominant systems that oftentimes marginalize women, particularly women who are mothering or caregiving in these spaces. But then it also talks about the really beautiful and radical and revolutionary potential of these spaces to be anti-authoritarian, to be non-hierarchical, to be leaderless. You know, the potential of these spaces to call out systems of domination. So in the work, I try to navigate those tensions, not to say that leftist spaces would be perfect or utopian, but to say that leftist spaces can achieve toward, can strive toward, but that means being vulnerable and calling out the ways in which it may not be living up to its ideals at different moments. But then also like naming political repression that they face and the beautiful ways in which they call it out and challenge it. And so it's a tense negotiation. I started the book thinking that this chilling legislation was going to silence the movement, that the 90s and 2000s were this apex of direct action. And then there's this legislation, and there's these arrests, and there become less actions. And I'm wondering, you know, why is this happening? And at the time of doing the research, everyone's scared of who's going to be arrested next, who's an informant, who's going to become a cooperative witness. And by the time the book goes to publication in 2021, it's over a decade later. And so it's a retrospective in some ways of, you know, actions did decrease, but why? Did they decrease because of the legislation? Did they decrease because the folks who were doing the actions in the 90s just got older and like they couldn't run as fast and they were tired, and there's a new generation and they have different tactics that they're using? Is it because a war started and lasted for a really long time in Iraq and Afghanistan and people's focus changed? I don't conclude with the answer to that, but I point to the fact that this legislation that we thought was going to be the ultimate chilling effect wasn't necessarily it. But I'd love to have like a discussion too. So that's my prepared remarks on the book, but I also am happy to discuss the work with all of you. Thank you again for coming.
So at the beginning of the pandemic, I became involved in a Buddhist Sangha that is online through Zoom. It's the Colorado, Boulder, Colorado Mindfulness Sangha. And, so one of the members is David Loy. If you've heard of him. But he runs the Eco Dharma Center. And I'm planning to go on a retreat there this summer, but something happened about a month or two ago where a man who was a member of that Sangha self-immolated in front of the Supreme Court. And I was just wondering if you had any, there's a lot of mixed emotions evidently between saying, members of our Sangha saying, suicide is not cool, that nobody in our group really encouraged that, yet this man felt so strongly and was probably involved in a movement like what your ethnographies are about, that he felt so strongly that that seemed appropriate to him. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So students that have taken some social movement classes with me, one of the activities that we do is this kind of nonviolent sociogram. And we map out the room into an X and Y axes, violent, nonviolent, effective, ineffective. And I read scenarios. And certain things, all students are like, that's very violent, but very effective. Or there's disagreements on things. They can range from Rod Coronado famously teaching people at NCORE how to create an incendiary device to a self-immolation case in a fur store. And the self-immolation always gets a strong response where initially all students go to very ineffective and very violent. But contrast that with previous scenarios, which are people go to confront an Aryan Nations gathering and get into physical conflict with activists. And people are like, that's not violent. Or doing a sit-in that leads to all of the people being pepper sprayed in close contact and beaten and incarcerated. And students are like, that's nonviolent because the violence is the state versus the violence is something you do to yourself. And I don't give students an answer. There is no right and wrong on that exercise. It's meant to be a provocative way to think about constructs of violence and how violence can be effective. But one of the big principles for Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front, it's like they're monikers. They're not organizations. You don't have a membership. You don't pay dues. There's no, there's a press office. But the press office is disconnected to the activists from an above ground, underground way. However, their main principle is doing no harm to living beings. And that includes oneself, so not perpetuating harm to oneself. So I think that would be equally contested and debated amongst the group, amongst activists that kind of take that position of doing no harm. Which is why those entities, those monikers, have never been invoked to actions that committed harm against humans. They destroy property. Property is not a human. It's a good question. I'm kind of answering it with like a provocation too of.
Good class exercise.
Yeah, it's good.
How do you feel things have changed tactically in the past however long since the increase of state repression in the past 5 or 10 years and stuff like that?
Well, they've changed in terms of what they're focusing on because one of the main things, so in the 90s it was like ski resorts being built, a lot of genetically modified laboratories were popping up and being targeted, and clear cutting still is a big focus, but now a lot of the focus is pipeline construction. And pipeline construction and those who are directly trying to interrupt and intercept it are engaging in all of these things. You have encampments, you have blockades, you have ways in which people are doing sabotage, trying to sabotage the land, being able to be used for that. So I think it's shifted because the mechanisms of ecological violence have shifted too in those ways. But I mean, it's also been co-opted quite a bit. So there's a lot written on kind of green capitalism and the ways in which Adrian Parr's famous book, which is like 10 years old now, Hijacking Sustainability, which really does a nice job of talking about militaries that have, the going green of the military. Corporations have gone green. And on the one hand, is that a good shift? I mean, maybe if it's like some less pollution, but is it a dangerous shift? Because it allows us, it's like happy happy meat? Like, does it make us think that it's okay? Does it absolve us of our complicity in whatever practices that we're doing? You know, so I think that being nimble is really important as an activist, because capitalism changes and the mechanisms of violence will change, and so your ability to perceive what is violence has to adapt, and the ways in which you're going to disrupt it and interrupt it also need to change. I think it's adapted in that way. Pandemic didn't help to kind of clandestine gathering, but yeah.
You have a question from somebody online. Daniel Gruner asks, or says, it seems like people's CVs and resumes are more important than ever today, demonstrating achievements and contributions of the person as well as persistent production of work within a field. Most people who committed direct action in ELF and Earth First can never share their actions. Do you have any thoughts on how to materially honor and include those people who did not invest in credentials and sanctioned activism as much as perhaps we did?
It's a good question, and it's one that I think about a lot in the work that I do, is by the anonymity of their actions and my name to the publication talking about their actions, in what ways am I benefiting from their vulnerabilities. By being able to do an ethnography on illegal direct action. You know, I shared this story in the book of when I went through TSA, and I had packed a bunch of different stuff because I was going to do research at it while I was attending a conference, and I had brought the ALF primer in my backpack. And I had this moment where I was like, I'm going to search my bag, I'm going to find this primer, and I immediately went to a space of, I'll just tell them I'm researching it. That distances me and it leverages my privilege as kind of a not them. And it was a good moment for me early in the work to recognize and be cautious. But on the flip of it, so to Daniel's question about how do you recognize, I do think though that carving out and taking seriously in academic spaces the rhetorical, political significance of this work does give them a space. I think David Graeber did this with his anti-globalization work and direct action. He created an academic archive of this work, but still protected the people that did it. And so a big thing that you can do if you have the means to do it is prisoner support work. You can do prisoner support work by raising money, by sending books, by engaging and supporting things like the CLDC and the National Lawyers Guild. You know, there's ways in which you can leverage your space on the outside to support those who are struggling. Eric King, who's been incarcerated and faced massive amounts of political repression for being an anarchist, by telling the stories, by talking about people who have been arrested, it does create a sense of historical record. But the problem is that most of the stories that we tell are about men in the movement. And so how do we create a space where women are talked about more often, and they're not just talked about as being a female in this space, but they're given the same amount of kind of credential, but you know, and there's tension. Not all the activists want the credentialing of having academic notoriety or professional notoriety. So I was really cognizant when I wrote this. Daniel McGowan is a person who was arrested with Operation Backfire. I would call him a friend. And I interviewed him, and I also wanted him to read certain sections of the book before they went to press. And that was my way of not using free labor and not exploiting him for his perspective, but it was more so to say, can you help me? Can you collaborate? Having collaborative research, so collaborative publications are one way that you can do that. I've attended conferences where people gave the keynote who were incarcerated. The conference took their plenary fee that they were going to pay to some person and donated it to the commissary fee of the person who was incarcerated. I think just being reflexive of the privilege that you're operating within and being as collaborative as possible has been. I don't know if that fully would do it, but
He asked me to thank you for your answer and your work.
okay.
very much for your presentation. You asked a question as why have actions decreased, and you laid out 3 possibilities: that activists are getting older, yes we are. That the legislation against the activists, that's hard to measure, but that's a possibility. And then recent war is a distraction, and it's also as a resource that has pulled away from activists, I think. And but I think there's also a number of things that, in terms of what activists are concerned about, the number of pressing concerns that as activists that we are bombarded with and that we are concerned about seem to multiply and take up a lot of headspace. And it starts to diffuse the energy, and it's really hard to know where to focus and how to focus. And just in the last, 8 political years, it's been really difficult to come together and to know where is our biggest concerns, not just environmentally, but politically, women's rights, LGBT rights. It's very hard to wrap your head around. We've only got so much energy. Where do we go with that? And so that's one thing. I think the second thing that I would offer is that capitalism and marketing has changed since the 80s and 90s,
Sure.
and it has become rabid, and it is very, very different from, when I was in my 20s and 30s. And it is, we were just talking about this today, that vegan leather, as much as I like my Doc Martens, is plastic. It's pleather. And these industries have done a really good job at marketing. And it's really hard to get across to the public at how well they have marketed their capitalism. And so it really has drawn attention away from people that would be otherwise supportive.
Yeah, I think that almost a return to some of the effective strategies of organizing that existed at heightened points when there was, you could say there was a saturation of problems. There was the Vietnam War. There was still an impending ecological crisis. There was reproductive rights. You had tension between feminist circles and queer circles, and there was a plenty at the time. You have still powerful in its sheer numbers. You look at like the Berkeley student movement, like the thing that made that powerful was multiple groups that were oppressed saying, we're all oppressed in different ways, but we know that that's the thing that's oppressing us, and let's temporarily form a coalition to target this one thing, which is one of the strategies that they do in the movement by doing pressure campaigns. It's part of what's called the shack tactic. The Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty campaign really used this. It said, there's a bajillion corporations. How do you pick one? You can't cover all of them. Oh, let's just pick one, and let's start there. So coalition building, and then also like consciousness raising groups, like bringing groups of people together in ways in which they feel comfortable and familiar, and having spaces to be vulnerable, to talk, to theorize, to dream. Somewhere along the way, we've kind of lost the ability to imagine what could be, which is why the political imaginary is so powerful. It's this ability to think of the thing that you don't see. You can't point to it and say, I want that. But that you have to say, we can create something. And what are the things that's going to go into that thing? What do we know we don't want to happen? What do we know we don't want in that space? And it's just the ability to kind of think outside of the current political moment. Yeah, I agree with you.
And do you see any coalition building happening in the 21st century at this time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in very strategic ways, but I think that there's a lot to say about organizing at this particular moment. And one of the things that's part of being all things to all people is we've created these ideals that the activist has to be a hero. And they have to be a pure hero. And they have to have all pure thoughts and all pure political beliefs. And they can't mess up and they can't be called in. And that's just an insurmountable task. We are all works in progress. I don't care how radical and revolutionary and brilliant a person is, there's more work to be done, right? Someone told me a long time ago, you should always be uncomfortable. You should never feel comfortable with the work you're doing. You should always have that little bit in you that's like, oh, but I'm uncomfortable that I'm doing X. Because that's what motivates us to keep going. But the tension of not acknowledging that uncomfortability with ourselves is not done has meant that we're scared to be vulnerable about the ways in which we're still working. And so when an activist or a coalition is meant to come together, if they don't live up to these ideals, then they're kind of pushed out, called out, removed, right? In a way that it mimics deplatforming, which is a beautiful anti-fascist tactic of the left, to take away platforms for hate, to take away platforms for fascists. But what we've done is we've kind of deplatformed the imperfections and the vulnerabilities and the need for work. So I think that's like a big, it's a tactic of control, it's a strategy of control for students that took that class. It's the government and establishment saying, you know, see, they're not a good enough activist. Where's that marketing coming from? Where is that trend coming from to be perfect? Probably coming from somebody who wants all of those coalitions and all of those movements to be demobilized.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't know who to call on. Sarah, go ahead.
Okay. So you talked a little bit now, and I know you talked a bit before about like how being a mother has affected the way you engage in activist spaces. And I was just curious if you like experienced the same thing with being an ethnographer, like if you felt like you were kept out of certain spaces and like you weren't able to engage in the same way because of that.
Yeah. So this is something that I share. So when my partner was arrested.
Can you repeat that question because I'm not sure that you could hear it.
To repeat the question. You asked about, I shared that I'm a mother and being a mother in the book and whatnot, but how does it impact ethnography and like being an ethnographer? Is that a fair enough paraphrase? Did I miss? Okay. So I share this story in the book about, you know, so when my partner was arrested, it was as part of kind of the anti-inaugural protest. So we went to DC, we brought our 3 children, we went the day before to this quote women's march, and we went to go for, that was on Saturday, right? January 21st, they have this march. So January 20th, J20, was the inauguration, and the anti-inaugural protests that were organized by folks all over the country came together. So my partner went to the demonstration the day before. I agreed to be with the kids because we realized that most likely we'd be getting arrested, and we were in a different city. We no longer lived in DC at the time. We didn't have any other childcare. So I said, I'll stay home with the kids, you go to that space, which is kind of a dynamic that a lot of folks navigating child rearing, there's one person that ends up doing that, and in kind of male-female dynamics, statistically, it's oftentimes the female. So I said, I'll go to the march tomorrow, you go to the march today. He gets arrested, and that all happens. And I share this story in the book of, you know, for 18 months we were under federal investigation. We couldn't talk about it. I couldn't know anything because of terrorism enhancements. I could have been grand jury. So I didn't want to have information that then I would be, you know, in a position where I'd be forced to testify. So, you know, relational tensions, and he's brought into support groups. And the defendants, there was, you know, over 100 defendants. He would go to DC, they had a legal support group, they would get together, they had a signal thread. There's a lot of infrastructure for the defendants. And I found it's this like vulnerability that you're like kind of uncomfortable sharing because you feel silly saying it. But I was like jealous of the network, and I was like mad at him because I'm like, you have all of those support systems, and there's no support network for the partner. And there's definitely no support network for me to be like, how do you explain this to your 3-year-old? And, that's definitely not a part of the thread. And so, I struggled with that kind of attention. So then fold that into the ethnographic work. There were many opportunities for me to pack up and go to a demo. I was at work one day and there was a demonstration against Delta, and I had my daughter with me and I was breastfeeding on demand, and I was like, I have to bring her because it's gonna take me an hour and a half to get there. I'm gonna be there for 2.5 hours. Then I'm gonna have to drive back an hour and a half. And I physically was tethered to somebody, right? And I made those choices, and I own that those were my choices. But I also own that I should be able to make those choices, and I shouldn't have to choose between the choices that I want to make as a caregiver, and the choices I want to make as an ethnographer, and the choices I want to make as an activist. But those embodied choices disproportionately face me more than my partner, my male-bodied partner. And so I reflect on that quite a bit of, how many missed opportunities did I have to go to the demo, to go to the convergence. I went to an Earth First rendezvous, and I was just sharing this with Rick, and they had a childcare tent, and I was like, this is great. I am gonna bring the kids, they're gonna play, and I'm gonna go to a talk. And I go, and this one woman is there with her kid, and she's like, no one runs the childcare tent except for people with children. And I was like, she's like, so you can stay here and watch my kid with your kid. And I was like, no, I don't want more of them. I wanted to let them play. And so depending on the research that you're doing, it certainly can be very alienating. And I talk about, being intentional in my ethnographic work of writing about that. I don't turn away from talking about, there was a night that I got to Canada and I was staying in an activist house, and it was this great opportunity, and I had an interview planned, and they're a key organizer, and my daughter was just not having it, screaming. And I was like, I have to make a choice. I can stay up and do this interview, or I can go comfort my kid. And I was like, I'll just try to comfort my kid, and then I'll get her to sleep, and I'll go down and do the interview. And it was 6 hours of pacing. And I got maybe an hour and a half of sleep, didn't do the interview, woke up the next day for this giant convergence, right? Hundreds of people, and I was just a zombie. I was I'm exhausted, and my kid's exhausted. I had to make decisions about, when you're attending a march, there's different proximities of where you put people strategically based on the ways in which the police are going to interact with that space. So oftentimes people would be like, put her in the front, put her in the back. Because I would be pregnant, and they'd be like, a white pregnant woman, put her in the back. And I'm like, but then you're making choices. And there's this tension of, I'm always not quite academic enough because I'm unapologetically a mother. I'm always not quite mothering enough because I'm an anarchist who takes my kids to demonstrations. I'm always not quite an activist enough because I'm an academic and because I'm a mother. And how you maneuver that, in many ways for me, is you carve those vulnerable spaces so that in some ways the literature has that representation, right? Without those ethnographers taking up that space won't exist. So there's ways in which I maneuver this with a lot of privilege. I have a doctorate, I have a partner, I'm white, there are many ways in which I am read as straight, I can operate into all those spaces. But then there's all these ways in which I don't have the same amount of privilege. And so how do you speak to that? How do you speak privilege and vulnerability simultaneously? And that's kind of, I think that answers it a bit. Dean, you had your hand.
Oh, sure. I'm wondering about some of these radical activist organizations and kind of the mainstream nonprofits. So ALF versus PETA, are some folks coming kind of from the mainstream out of frustration and becoming radicalized. So can talk about that kind of relationship and even how these folks get
Yeah.
radicalized in the first place.
Yeah, it's a great question. So my first ethnographic study was when I was a master's student. I went and lived with Farm Sanctuary in upstate New York. And I was like very much kind of coming of age with my political views, but also still in that kind of mainstream. Farm Sanctuary is the country's largest farm animal rescue organization. So it's a big space in that kind of animal rights milieu. And so, while there, kind of get introduced to other things. And I think that arc is what many people follow, which is, I say like I'm disenchanted. Like I think people start out believing the dominant narratives about change. Think about how you first learned about change and history. Who writes history books and how do we tell, well, Kevin writes history books. He's a good historian. But the stories we tell about history tell us something. They are meant to prove a point. They contribute to our understandings of the world, right? Think about how you tell the stories of your life. You make sense of the past by the present. And so the ways in which activism happens is you're told stories about how change took place. How did change happen? We learn about suffrage. It's not as talked about, hunger strikes, strategic use of arrest, clogging the courts, police brutality, smuggling letters from the prison to a journalist, to getting notoriety, to then all of a sudden people care. But no, it's about how the women called people up. And so how we tell stories about the past inform the ways in which we ourselves become uncomfortable with what we see around us. And I think that trajectory is what many people grapple with. So in my first ethnography, I'm at this organization and I get turned on to this activist who writes this book about kind of social movements, Bill Moyer, not Bill Moyers, and talks about the 4 buckets of activism, and he talks about these, the 4 main categories. And so I was really interested in this idea of different types of organizations. Which one's the best, right? Which ones are bad? Which ones are good? Which ones are more effective? And his point still informs me today, which is you have to have all of them. You have to have the people who will go into a laboratory and take investigative footage and leak it to the public because they force a conversation that's not going to happen by signing a petition. And you have to have the petitions because for some folks, that's reaching them where they're at. And maybe that will bring them to somewhere else. And it's the dialectic, it's the negotiation between these different types of groups, I think, that become very productive for social change. So it's, yes, I have a view of how I choose to engage and how I would like to see change, brought about. But I think that the reality is that all of these different types of organizations, all of these different strategies and tactics have to coexist because of the ways in which people come to their activism and the ways in which that activism works in their material life. Not everybody is able to or wants to. This is a big tension in leftist circles. This is why Black Bloc is really powerful, and the idea of being anonymous is because when people come into spaces and they engage in an act, like with the J20 arrests, people who are undocumented, people who are trans and are concerned with how they're going to be interpolated inside the prison system. How do you work as a community to take care of each other? And so you can't say everyone should go do that because not everybody can and wants to, and it wouldn't necessarily work. So I think the tension of having multiple types of organizations is productive. I think it's good. It's who we can critique. And it can inform what those critiques are, but at the same time, they can critique things that the other groups are doing. I just think that tension is really important. And that many folks follow that arc. They do, of kind of starting off in one place, being frustrated. And I would say that other social movements have followed some similar trajectories, and there's been tensions historically within movements about strategies of agitation. You know, how should we bring about change? It's not exclusive to this movement. Any other questions?
Are you familiar with an organization called the Non-Human Rights Project? Well, the reason I brought that up, right before I came over here today, I was reading our Dayton Daily newspaper.
Sure.
And in it was an article saying that yesterday, New York's top court, the Court of Appeals, in a 5-2 decision, affirmed an earlier court decision that said, Happy the Elephant. I don't know if you're familiar with the Happy the Elephant case, but I bring this up just to, and I know this is quite maybe a little tertiary to what you've been talking about this evening, but I'm just going to ask you for comment. Maybe somebody else in the audience would find this interesting. But it said, Happy the Elephant, in this majority decision. No one disputes that elephants are intelligent beings deserving of proper care and compassion, but the decision was that Happy is not a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Non-Human Rights Project brought this case forward, and it has been watched very, very closely by animal rights activists and the industries that depend on animals as well. Now, Happy is in a zoo, so this brings to mind the questions dealing with zoos and so forth. And the Non-Human Rights Project argued that Happy is an autonomous, cognitively complex elephant worthy of rights reserved by law for people. And of course, the court's ruling the elephant isn't a person. The Bronx Zoo argued Happy is neither illegally imprisoned nor a person, but a well-cared-for elephant, respected as the magnificent creature that she is. And I've been thinking a lot about your Happy tonight as I've listened to your presentation. Could we just get a reaction?
I never liked the insistence on sentience and cognitive complexities as a barometer for if something is autonomous. Because I think that the same lines of argument have led to the exploitation and massive forms of violence that humans that are deemed non-sentient, or humans that are deemed non-cognitively complex, have been institutionalized, sterilized, and brutalized, to be honest, in many different ways. And so I'm always weary of kind of using personhood as this barometer for care, protection, or even autonomy. And so for me, speciesism is a very powerful framework to critique because it calls into question, the right of one's autonomy, the right over one's body. Who has the right to make the decisions about themselves, about their reproductive capacities, about where they live, their freedom to move? And when we start asking those questions and we find ourselves answering them by saying, well, because they don't feel, because they don't mourn, or because they're unsophisticated, because they don't communicate, that's when you start to see the foundations of speciesism are so deeply connected to these structured hierarchies that we've used to perpetuate violence against other humans. And so for me, that's the part of total liberation that's very powerful, is by taking a framework. It doesn't say that speciesism is the same thing as sexism. It doesn't say that it's, a big Mac, where it's all just stacked on top of each other. But it does say that the rhetorical strategies that we use to excuse violence tap into these psyches. They tap into these rationalizations. I mean, I can speak from my own family history. My grandfather's biggest insistence was, they were told they were like animals, they were like dogs by the Nazis. And that by deeming them a certain type, they were vermin. Look at the propaganda. How were they described? That becomes a way to say they're less than human. And even the actual industrial practices, chattel slavery and the use of shipping and transporting animals industrially. Marjorie Spiegel's book, The Dreaded Comparison, is a really interesting look at the construction of cargo ships, the movement of cattle cars, and the ways in which we contain human bodies is literally modeled off of industrial practices that exist in other spaces. And, what does that tell us about the slippery logic? So I don't want to invest in saying that we protect elephants because they feel, or chimpanzees because they do this. Because I think I'm investing in a hierarchical notion that because certain things feel or are more like, they deserve more protection. And I'm not willing to commit to that because I think history has shown and contemporary practices have shown that by deeming bodies hysterical, right? Female bodies can be seen as hysterical, they must be controlled. By pathologizing bodies, we permit things like sterilization. Oh, somebody is born with a particular genetic, quote, defect. They should be sterilized, or they should be genetically altered so that they won't experience puberty. Because we don't want them to grow and be too strong because of this or that, and they're not capable. So I think Happy the Elephant kind of opens that conversation, but it's one that I'm always very weary of. Yeah, I think it's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you talked about talking to groups that self-sterilize, and I was like literally a mother of 4 children, because the narrative behind climate right now, or climate crisis right now, is that we don't have enough time, different women having children, or like the overpopulation narrative that's happening. Like, what was it like navigating that space?
So right before the book came to press, I was looking at something on Facebook, and a really prominent activist had posted that they just had a vasectomy. And I include this in the book, and there were all these comments. Thank you. You did it for humanity. Remember the day when we used to go and have the V Club and we would all go out for beers afterward? And it's like, it was over 25 comments of people being like, thank you, and congratulating this person for doing this selfless act for humanity. And so, and I think there's merit. Reproductive choice means reproductive choice. It means free, accessible abortion at any point. It means being able to get sterilized and not having that be a financial burden, and it means being able to do this and be able to do that. I believe in that. And I support this person choosing to do that. But I think spaces like that make it even more difficult for people like me to go into them with a child, being pregnant. Literally the first home demonstration I went to, somebody called me a vegan birther. I was like, but I was 5 months pregnant. There was no way for me to hide it, nor did I want to. And so it goes back to the embodiedness, the ways in which reproductive labor is embodied, the ways in which care labor is embodied for certain people. And so it's stifling and it's problematic when it's meant to alienate or ostracize. And it kind of marginalizes people from these spaces. And then you look around and you wonder, why when we talk about the animal and earth liberation movement, do we list Peter Young? And we want to talk about Rod Coronado, we want to talk about plenty of other people, and then you're Daniel McGowan, who's these interesting, good people, but I'm sure that there were women, and in fact, when you look at the history of caring about these movements and caring about these issues, it's predominantly women. So yet there's this asymmetry of leaders. In a leaderless movement, you still have leaders, visionaries, but then you have people doing the work. And why is there this disconnect? Well, maybe part of it's because they don't want to step into a more visible space and be called out for their reproductive choices. It's easier to kind of conceal or to hide when it's not something that's visible. My partner can go to a summit and be present and be in that space and leave, and nobody would know the difference. But if you make the choice, and he makes the choice to bring children into it on his own, but it's almost like congratulatory. Like, wow, you're so great. You're in the movement and you're doing this, like, good for you. But then if I'm in that space, it's like, shh, like, just go. And I'm like, and it's not everyone, and I think it'll shift. The pandemic has forced a little bit of like the personal and the political to become more visible. But what?
It's like let the babies run around and get small as they're doing their thing.
Yeah, we're getting old. You need babies.
Yeah.
We're tired. Jordan, did you have your hand up?
Bonnie and I have talked a lot about like enrichment, because when they shared their story about the elephant, I think a lot about the white tigers that were in the aquarium. Like me, I was like a shark kid, so I was like, oh, I like the aquarium, I like the zoo to see them. But as I got older, I was like, I don't like these spaces, but I like these things. So in the aquarium in Houston, we had 2 white tigers, and they were in this space that was maybe like from the end of the projector to here, with a glass space, and it was just lit, and there was a wall and a pond, and there was just tigers in the space for people to see before they go into the gift shop. Like that was the big exhibit before you go into the gift shop. And it was in my 2nd year that they got an entire outdoor enclosure, and I've been seeing those tigers since I was a child. That was when they decided these tigers need an outdoor space to go frolic with big cat toys. And Bonnie and I talk mostly because in high school, I was like, I don't care about pandas. There's microorganisms in the ocean that are important, and we're spending all our monies on pandas who don't want to like have sex. So I would say those things, people were like, what are you talking about? I was like, I don't care about bees. Honeybees are invasive. There's natural pollinators that are more like that we should be sustaining in place of these commodified like things. And we're like, well, this is not about the environment, and like why people say this and saving the sea turtles and like recycling, but recycling will go into landfills if you recycle in the hood. So you're not really doing anything because they don't actually do the facilities well. So it was always like Band-Aids to like broken glass that's spilling water and about to like pressurize ballroom. I felt like all the time that's the visual image that I have of like when people talk about what we should do and being like, okay, so what are you going to do?
Thank you.
That's it.
Next one. So,
Well, a lot of people brought up your experience, like asking me questions about your experience being a mother in those spaces, and it just, it makes me think, because my parents were also younger parents with like a huge group of children going into these spaces as well, and I was always there alone, and it makes me think about like children's space in activism and how it's actually like it's like not tolerated, and like how that's really interesting in just like in considering like politics and views and core values and like specifically anarchists, and then to like extremely exclude an entire like sect of people to the point that like a lot of people won't participate because they feel like they can't bring children into spaces like that because people get so irritated because you can't have teach-ins, you can't have demonstrations, you can't have skill shares with children running around. It's not productive. It's not. And I don't know. I find that really interesting, and I wonder if that's something you guys consider going to stuff.
yeah, we do. It's just true. And we found there was something in Athens a couple of years ago, and it was more inviting than the last rendezvous that we had gone to. It was in California, which like maybe Ohio gets credit for that. I don't know. It's an Athens thing. It was like organized by local people, but I think it's a good question, and I think that it's just unfortunately, like people who are willing to put themselves out there and and just like demand an element of those spaces. But then you're accused of like, but you're privileged because you chose to have kids and that's your problem. And like you figure that out. That's not my problem. Especially when like you're ruining the planet. Which by the way is really, you know, problematic, because when you think about human population and population control, it's not going to be the middle class people who are electively being sterilized that are going to like curb population control. Population control narratives are inherently targeting the global south and black and brown bodies in even the United States. So it's an ironic and problematic thing to like talk about, which like I don't think is like always said enough. But yeah, I think that it's a problem, and
do you think that it do you think that it'll affect, like, I don't know, like over the pandemic, like, you know, every teenager on the internet was radicalized by TikTok. Like people like to say that. And it just makes me think about how like that's like probably the most like left-leaning, like extreme radicalization that like a large group of young children probably have been exposed to in a long time. Like we haven't had a war that's been like super intense in a hot minute. And I think about that. I think about like how my family grew up with the AIDS crisis, and so they had this consciousness in how they were handling up people, and I don't know, just like kind of navigating like marginalized scenes. And it makes me think, I don't know, I just like think on how like we have a growing interest in activism, but we have not a large acceptance of children in those spaces. And I find it interesting because we have a lot of people right now who have been isolated, and I just wonder how that will shift in the future with more activists happening.
yeah.
More activism happening.
And I think there's been like child-led movements, you know, like Greta has like become this face of like kids can care, and like it's our world that we're inheriting from you, and you've ruined it. So I think there's like more conversation happening for kids because of urgency, because the sense of urgency specific to the planet, it's interesting because, you know, animal compassion for other species is something that for many children, like it's something that they have to be untaught, right? Like there's a moment at some point that you questioned, like, you mean to tell me that my nuggets were that? Like there was at some point the cognitive dissonance became less obvious, or as Carol Adams calls, the absent referent becomes removed. And maybe it wasn't a profound moment for you, but for a lot of people there's like a moment, and they kind of get uncomfortable with it, and they just say like, it doesn't matter because that's, you know, I'm hungry, or that's what's available, or that's what we eat, and that's what it's there for, and it kind of goes away. So it's interesting that in a movement where seemingly it would be a space where children would have synergies, the environment, thinking about ecology, thinking about species and compassion, is yet this space that we kind of close off. But when people get together and they talk about the moment they were kind of, quote, radicalized, it's like something in their childhood, right? Or something that happened as a teen, or like it's this point where they kind of came to terms with something. It didn't happen when they were like attending a lecture when they were 45 and someone was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Any other questions? We have time?
Reminded of the books.
What?
Reminded
Oh, you could buy the book. I have the book available for a discounted rate, so it's $20 if you buy it now. It's $26 if you buy it online. And I didn't read you the whole book, I promise. There's more. And I try to kind of balance like giving some theory to telling stories that tell theory. so that it's not too much of one and not enough of the other.
And if we wanted to contact you to like ask you a question or something,
Absolutely.
how can we get in touch with you?
You're more than welcome to email me. It's just jgrubbs@Antioch College. JGRUBBS@AntiochCollege.edu. I always pause on that part.
Word.org for some.
I would love to be in touch and have, these are great conversations. It's not too often that I get to like sit back and really reflect on this thing that took a long time to do. And it came out during the pandemic, and I was like very explicit in that of like, this came out at a time that I'm on like lockdown with my 4 kids who are not in school, and
Talk more about being investigated by the feds.
oh.
No.
The next one.
Next one.
Well, once like the charges were dropped, then I could like talk more about it in general. But it was an interesting experience because I started off being like, I'm going to theorize about state repression. I'm going to theorize about the ways in which activists experience surveillance, the ways in which they're repressed, the ways in which they feel marginalized and isolated from each other, and little did I know. I mean, he'd been arrested before, and we'd been in trouble before at demonstrations, but not like this. Mm-hmm. And so when this happened, it was like, not only was he detained for 2 days, and we had to stay in DC and explain that to like everyone, but it meant our phones had to be in lock boxes if we talked about anything. Like, there were things that I just couldn't ask for a long time. And it's not like I could go to a meeting with his lawyer and have an idea of how it was going to go. I genuinely had no idea. And like under the Trump presidency, it was just kind of a question mark. Like, what's Jeff Sessions going to do? And they had a ton of undercover surveillance. They were, they had informants that were attending organizing workshops. They had emails. They subpoenaed all of his emails. They subpoenaed his professional email account. He had to explain it to his employer. And it was hard because, you start off really like, the state's bad and the state represses and people shouldn't cave to the state. And then I'm like looking at him, I'm like, why didn't you run? You're so dumb. He's got trouble. And I was like mad, and I'm like envious that he has the support network. And it really took theory, right? All these theories about, Weber's monopoly of violence and thinking about Foucault and, took all of that, and instead it was like my life. And the crux of it was like, I found out I was pregnant when he was under investigation. And when I told him, it was not like, wow, we're having a 4th kid. I was like, I'm pregnant, and I think I'm about 3 months. And I just like watched his eyes say, March, April, May. And he literally was like, my trial is in October, you're due in December. I could be incarcerated by the time that he's born. And so like, then I'm sitting there saying, so does that mean that I should continue a pregnancy that could be this complicated? And what if I'm just like really stressed out? And how am I gonna do that? And that was like this moment where being under investigation, theorizing about power became a part of my life. And then I'm sitting there thinking about my own reproductive choices and my family planning and my life. And yeah, it's just, I was at a rendezvous when the charges were dropped. And the only reason they were dropped was because of prosecutorial error. They didn't disclose evidence that they were using. Part of this undercover footage wasn't given to the defense. And so they had to, he was the last trial block. They had put everybody in blocks, and they were dropping charges along the way. His trial block was the very last block of people that still had charges standing, meaning they were probably the most likely, because he's a an academic and an activist, and he writes books on this, and he can't claim, like, I didn't know what they were gonna do. You knew! You're an expert in this. So it was definitely a very humbling and like real part of it. But then also, like, he wasn't incarcerated, and so I walk away from it still saying, and it wasn't necessarily because he had a good lawyer, it wasn't his lawyer that did it, it was error. But he wasn't incarcerated, and so what does that mean for my obligation to support those who don't have prosecutorial negligence who become incarcerated? Like, it created another sense of indebtedness to what does it mean to put that on the line.
Did it change your sort of participation levels in marches or demonstrations?
Just while he was under investigation. You are not going out. Put your backpack down, you're staying home. No, but it made me aware, going back to like parents in the movement, of like what contingency plans would I have in place? Can we go to these spaces together? Because, you know, we operate in these spaces very differently and have different histories within different social settings, to where sometimes, like, I would lean on his social capital because he lived in DC for 10 years, because he had been, you know, prominent within these circles, because he physically is read differently. He has a circle A on his arm, he's a septum ring. I'm like read as like anarchist Barbie in these spaces, and people are like, you're not lefty enough because you don't look a certain way. And it, you know, someone really did call me that at a rendezvous also. It's like, cool. But I guess it changed the ways in which we maneuvered them together because of understanding like the stakes. Like, he really was facing a lot, and the prison sentence was long, and the charges were trumped up, and you know they did collective charging, so everybody had the same charges. It's not called collective charges. There's not. It's my brain isn't working fully, but there's a different word for that. Yeah. All right. I think that's it.
Thank you.